Surgeon Arms,
It's on.
this is it.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We are back, audio is on. So as we were saying, over the summer and through the fall, we have been working hard to evaluate all our options for COVID mitigation measures and best practice for a building as unique as ours. We took steps early on to implement a mask policy in the State House. The House has needed to continue to meet in person and to create greater flexibility and distancing. The House Rules Committee voted to change the rules to allow members to vote from anywhere in the chamber through the first week of the session. And we'll talk at House Rules about possibly continuing that when we get into January. To help address capacity issues in committee rooms and other spaces in the building, you will see that there are signs outside of every room stating the capacity limits for each room. And making sure that all Vermonters have access to our legislative work, our IT staff have been working tremendously hard, and we know that we have now the ability to live stream our committee rooms as well as live stream the House and Senate floor. A huge big thank you and shout out to our IT staff for making all of this possible in a short amount of time. Our sessions will be continue to be available on YouTube, and there will be overflow space in the building available to the public to ensure that we are all safely distanced. The Sergeant at Arms has purchased air filtration systems that will be strategically placed around the State House to help with air purification and circulation. We are continuing the discussion and are close to finalizing a testing protocol and vaccination requirement for the State House. This would require staff and members to be vaccinated or to participate in a testing schedule to ensure a high level of health and safety protections for all of us. We are also working on a surveillance testing plan to make sure that we have a way to monitor and hopefully identify an individual that may be asymptomatic, there we go, and be unaware that they are carrying the virus. Additionally, we are working on the policy and discussion on what a similar policy would look like for the general public, advocates, lobbyists, press, etc., and entering the building. We will continue to discuss these policies with public health experts to make sure we are in alignment with the best, most up-to-date health and safety mitigation measures.
We are continuing to finalize our vaccine and testing protocols and other policies to allow for a safe return to the building. The respective rules committees will meet regularly over the next few weeks to continue the conversation, including hearing from public health experts and including establishing data-driven thresholds for when we might make a call to go fully remote or to remove mitigation strategies like our masking policy if, as we all hope, things do eventually get better.
If you have questions or want to continue the discussion about this, please don't hesitate to reach out to my office, to the Pro Tem's office, or with your leadership team. The other topic we wanted to talk with you about is to talk about the two policy presentations on important issues facing our state, climate and housing. But before we do that, the Pro Tem and I want to share a little preview of the feedback from the public engagement process we held this fall and how it helped to identify these areas for a deep dive this afternoon.
So if at this point, Teresa, you could pull up the presentation and make sure everybody can see that in the chamber. Great. So many of you joined the speaker and me over the summer to virtually meet with Vermonters across the state to discuss this once in a lifetime opportunity that we have in front of us, that we can use all of these federal dollars to make significant investments that could potentially transform and shape the future of our state in a really positive way. Thanks to federal stimulus funds, a surge in state revenues, and more potential federal funds on the way, we are well positioned to make historic investments in Vermont's pandemic recovery, address critical infrastructure needs, support Vermonters' health and well-being, and strengthen Vermont's communities, businesses, environment, and climate.
touring around the state and meeting with Vermonters from every county was a really amazing opportunity to hear directly from a wide range of individuals and hear their experiences on what is impacting them in their day-to-day lives. We are still organizing the data that was collected from these discussions, and a report will be presented to all members and will be available and ready to use to inform the policy and budgetary work when we convene in January. While this work is ongoing, we wanted to share with you today and give you a quick snapshot on the process and what we heard. We could go to slide 2.
So we talked to over 1,400 Vermonters across 14 counties, and we had them respond to these questions. What's going well in your community? What are you struggling with the most? And what investment could we make in Vermont that would have the biggest positive impact on our future? If you could go to slide 3. We left the questions open-ended, and it prompted thoughtful, productive conversations. Many conversations. I wish you all could have been part of all that we heard. We learned so much about all of your communities from these incredible conversations that we had. And in many instances, we had more to say at the end, and it was just a really wonderful way of engaging. And I hope it's a format that we'll continue to use long after the pandemic is gone. So regardless of participants' experience with the legislative process, advocacy, or budgeting, it was a chance for them to fully engage in the process in a way that perhaps they never had before. If we could go to slide 4.
Thank you. So we gathered feedback in 3 ways. We had nearly 900 people respond to the online questionnaire that we disseminated broadly in order for maximum participation. Slide 5. Yep. And slide 6. Thank you. We held 16 virtual town halls focused on each county in the state to ensure geographic distribution. We met in small groups, small breakout groups, so that we could hear directly from participants and use note takers to record all the conversations. Thank you to all of the legislators who participated and volunteered to help us with this part of the conversation. Slide 7, please. We had 19 small group conversations that were the result of our intentional outreach to groups and communities we knew would be missing from our town hall and questionnaire sample, and including but not limited to BIPOC and low-income Vermonters, people living with mental health issues and disabilities, young farmers, youth, and more.
The results of our conversations highlighted many of the things we already knew, but also provided really helpful details for us and insight from those with lived experiences. Our analysis is preliminary at this point, but these bubbles represent some of the key themes that emerged. So it looks like perhaps we should go to the next slide. Great. Yeah, thanks, Teresa. They are sized based on the total number of comments we heard about each theme. So number 1, far and away, the biggest take-home lesson from this process was that in every corner of the state, people are struggling with the cost, access, and stability of housing. We heard that loud and clear. Number 2, we heard about a range of physical infrastructure priorities, including broadband access, public and rural transportation, the need to upgrade electric grid, water and sewer systems, and roads. Number 3, we heard about the devastating effects of insufficient services to address Vermonters' increased needs for mental health services, addiction and recovery support, and disability care. People talked about significant challenges with access to primary care, cost of healthcare, and healthcare workforce shortages, which I'm sure you're all hearing about in each of your communities. But perhaps the most heartening conversations that we had about where people are and the value and strength of Vermont communities is the importance of investing in local decision-making, local solutions to problems.
Number 5, people shared stories of worker shortages across sectors from hospitality, trades, and the service sector, and the impact of this shortage on our economy and on our health. Number 6, many people expressed fears about climate change and the urgency to curb carbon emissions, build community resilience, and invest in renewable energy, weatherization, electrified transportation, and green incentives. Number 7, we heard about the economy. It was often about the high cost of living and the impacts of the housing crisis, workforce shortages, and insufficient childcare. Number 8, we heard about the importance of childcare to our workforce and the staggering lack of options, the high cost, and the workforce shortages faced by the industry. Number 9, people spoke about the importance of preserving Vermont's natural beauty through land preservation, measures to address air and water quality, and investments in our recreation resources. And number 10, and many of our conversations drove home the interconnectedness of all of these themes.
Much of this reinforces what we've known, what we have identified in the past as important issues for Vermonters, and we have taken steps in addressing these issues in the last few sessions. We also took the important step to, bucket those ARPA dollars to continue to make investments that are obviously very important to Vermonters in all 14 counties.
Much of this, but we know we have much more to do. So today we're going to hear policy presentation on 2 of these topics, housing and climate, as we look forward to diving into finding with you more in-depth information in January. And as we get further into our analysis process, we will share interactive data slides so that you can dig into statewide themes, regional priorities, and specific participant comments. So thank you for, again, your participation in the process as we held these tours. And now I will turn it back over to Catherine Benham to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Julie Moore, who is the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, and she is on the Climate Council and is going to present on the Climate Action Plan. Is that Julie? And Julie, we're doing, when we get to questions, I'll help with questions.
Okay, great.
Do you want to stand on or not? No.
Yeah, so I heard that this morning, so I brought my own computer so I can click along with you. Thank you. I could, it's fine. I think we can just do it on 2 screens simultaneously. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Moore, the Secretary of Natural Resources. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today in the well of the House. I'm going to provide a bit of background just to make sure everyone's on the same page and up to speed with the Global Warming Solutions Act and the work of the Climate Council over the last year plus. And then talk about some of the high priority recommendations contained in the Climate Action Plan that was adopted just a week ago. Next slide, if you would. Starting with just a reminder as to why action is needed. The University of Vermont Gund Institute completed their 2021 climate assessment just a few weeks ago and updated some of the statistics around climate change in Vermont. This report that they've produced is a wealth of information. Some of it is carried forward into the Climate Action Plan, but I put some of the most salient points on the screen in front of you, in that average air temperatures are increasing, even more so in the winter. Spring is arriving sooner and winter later. And perhaps most striking to many, particularly in southern Vermont this summer, has been that this fairly significant increase in not only annual precipitation, but the frequency of more intense events. And when saying intense events, talking about where more than an inch of rain falls as a result of a single storm. And that the number of days that happens in Vermont has doubled in the last 50 years. Next slide. So the Global Warming Solutions Act was enacted in September of 2020, And the first meeting of the Climate Council was held November 20th of that year. The Climate Council is comprised of 15 appointees from the legislature and 8 administration officials, myself included. And we worked really, really hard for the last year to be able to adopt the initial climate action plan Wednesday of last week. Next slide, please. As you may recall, the charge to the Climate Council was 7-fold. The items I've highlighted in green on this slide are what I think of as the core components of that charge: reducing greenhouse gas emissions, achieving long-term sequestration and storage of carbon in order to get to net zero emissions by 2050, and then building climate adaptation and resilience in both Vermont's communities as well as our natural and working lands. The council also importantly layered over all of this an equity lens, trying to ensure that we are giving heightened attention to marginalized and underserved communities, which we know face disproportionate effects from a changing climate. Next slide. So I tried to figure a way to show the whole of the climate action plan on a single slide, and that's what's in front of you. The climate action plan in the end contains over 230 actions, individual actions, that are broadly either in service of reducing greenhouse gas emissions or improving landscape level resilience. The act treats those 2 buckets of work fairly separately, in that greenhouse gas mitigation are requirements, and the plan is supposed to identify the specific initiatives, programs, and strategies, including regulatory and legislative changes necessary to achieve those reductions. On the resilience side, it's a little more open-ended. It asks for a suite of actions consistent with building and encouraging adaptation and resilience. So as a result, most of the recommendations that I'm going to take you through at a very high level on the greenhouse gas side either require rulemaking from the Agency of Natural Resources or will require legislative activity. Whereas on the other side, there's a little bit more room and partner involvement in seeing that work implemented. Next slide. The climate action plan itself is organized into 5 impact areas: cutting pollution, which is greenhouse gas emissions reductions, looking at the resilience of our natural and working lands, the resilience of our communities, capturing carbon, and then we also identified a handful of actions that are cross-cutting, that actually are really significant in terms of the benefit that they offer in one or more than one of these other impact areas. And I'll start by talking about the greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategies. So this graph may be familiar to many of you. It is produced as part of the Energy Action Network's annual Pathways report, and it's based on data that is developed at the Agency of Natural Resources in our greenhouse gas emissions inventory. The most recent inventory that is broadly available at this point was for data collected and modeled in 2018, where it shows that we had 8.64 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents emitted that year. Our goal by 2025 is to reduce that to 7.38. Further reductions are required by 2030 to get to 5.18, and then ultimately driving carbon emissions to just 1.73 million metric tons by 2050. It may jump out at some of you just from the shape of that graph, but the 2030 target is a considerably more aggressive and challenging target than the 2025, just given the slope of the line between where we sit today and where we need to find ourselves. Next slide, please. So the recommendations are grouped under things like transit and buildings, and then some other non-energy sources. And at the highest level, in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions associated with transportation, we're looking at providing incentives to Vermonters for EV purchasing, building charging stations to help Vermonters overcome range anxiety. There is a recommendation to join the Transportation Climate Initiative Program. As those paying attention at home may know, As of the date of adoption of the Climate Action Plan, the future of TCI is far from certain. Massachusetts and Connecticut within the last month withdrew. And so it's not immediately clear if and how Vermont could adopt or participate absent other states' commitments to join. There is a recommendation to adopt the California Advanced Car and Advanced Truck rules, and that would be implemented through ANR-led rulemaking, as well as on the next slide, electrifying medium and heavy duty vehicle auxiliary systems. These are things like refrigeration units on trucks, creating infrastructure that supports bike ped access, and working to educate drivers on the benefits of electrification, but also on the importance of reducing their vehicle miles traveled. Next slide. Just to give you a sense of the magnitude of what's required in this space, by 2025, we would need to have an estimated 43,000 electric or zero emission vehicles on the road in Vermont. Currently, there are about 433,000 vehicles registered in Vermont, and just about 1% of them are electric or zero emission vehicles, so less than 5,000. That number jumps to 166,000 vehicles, electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles on the road by 2030, including that over 80% of new vehicles sold at that time would need to be electric. In thinking about better buildings, the focus first and foremost is on expanding weatherization. We've talked about a proposal for weatherization at scale, which would see, and I've got a little bit more information on that in a second. In addition, talked about a clean heat standard, which is really a performance standard to drive the transition to less carbon intensive heating practices, drawing on the experience and expertise of fuel service providers. Also looking to incentivize the adoption of things like heat pumps and modern wood heat systems, particularly as Vermonters' furnaces may wear out and be in need of replacement, to make sure we are at the ready to help them make a clean energy choice. Instituting a rental property efficiency standard, knowing that rental properties often are left behind in some of these transitions. And looking at the state building energy code, not just updating it to be as modern as possible, but also helping municipalities ensure compliance with the energy code. On the next slide, you'll see the number of homes that would need to be weatherized, as well as some other facts around heat pumps and heating with biofuels. As you may know, through weatherization efforts in the state of Vermont, we've weatherized about 30,000 homes over the last 18 years. These numbers shown on the slide are in addition to that. So again, a dramatic scaling up of weatherization would be needed to achieve the greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirements. On the next slide, I've actually shown it as a graph, just so you can get a sense of that increasing or that exponential growth over time. This year, we're on track to weatherize, I think, around 1,400 to 1,800 homes. So we'd be looking at 2,500 next year. But by the end of the current decade, hopefully be on track to weatherize between 15 and 20,000 homes a year. On the next slide, we look at clean, reliable energy. And this is continuing to shift us away from fossil fuels. Probably the most important consideration here is that as we weatherize cars and homes, we're anticipating that the total demand for electricity in Vermont will double from where we're at today by 2050. And so ensuring that we have a low carbon or carbon-free energy portfolio is really important to achieving greenhouse gas emissions reductions. It doesn't do us any good if our electricity is derived from fossil fuel sources. In addition, we know that many of Vermont's homes and buildings do not have electrical service that's currently able to support the types of electrification practices that are proposed in the Climate Action Plan, and making sure that that enabling action takes place, as well as investments in load management and grid optimization, things like battery storage and other smart storage tools. And the graph on the next page just shows where that dramatic growth in electricity demand in Vermont is anticipated to occur. The vast majority of it is in the transportation sector, which isn't a surprise. And there's also some fairly significant growth in the residential property sector. On to the next slide. Then there's sort of a catch-all section, which is looking at other greenhouse gas reduction opportunities. And these really run the gamut from methane capture on farms to looking at refrigerants with high global warming potential, fluorinated gases associated with the semiconductor industry, and flares at municipal wastewater facilities. I think probably what's most important in this space is just to keep in mind, this isn't a pick list. In order to achieve the greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act, we need to do all of these things, and all of these things at scale. The graph on the next page shows sort of the pace of the work that needs to occur over the next 30 years. Those gray bars or the dashed line bars show what we would call the business as usual case. We do expect that there would be some amount of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont just by virtue of improved technologies, more efficient vehicles, more efficient heating systems, regardless of anything else. And so those white bars represent what we believe would happen absent any further intervention. And then the colored stacked bars show where the reductions are needed in order to achieve the requirements of the Act. If you click to the next slide, Teresa, it just gives you a sense of where those targets are. And again, just pointing out the business as usual case with very little intervention on our part would likely allow us to achieve the 2025 target. However, if we don't start work now, getting to that 2030 reduction target will be very difficult, if not impossible to achieve. Flip to the next slide. We're going to talk about resilient and working in natural lands and the types of investments that can be made in service of both mitigating emissions and improving resilience. You want to flip to the next slide? This includes investing in management practices that have those dual benefits, things that are concerned with forest health as well as soil health. And these are actually many of the same practices that are important for clean water, things like cover crops, expanded buffers, et cetera. So there are some win-wins, clear win-wins in this space. The Climate Council also recommends expanding our reliance on nature-based solutions and traditional ecological knowledge. This would include strategic investments in conservation, as well as looking at ways to connect some of those nature areas with river corridors, floodplains, and wetlands. And then an acknowledgement that we really need to support and empower Vermont's natural and working landowners, managers, and caretakers, and the local markets that help them remain financially viable. The next set of recommendations is around vital communities. And this looks at both protecting people and infrastructure from climate impacts. If you want to flip to the next slide. This includes planning practices, a climate toolkit, if you will, that will help communities prepare for climate impacts and updates to land use policies. It looks at increasing the resilience or hardening of key infrastructure, everything from transportation to energy to communications to water and sewer. And then helping our institutional facilities, schools, and municipalities reduce fossil fuel use. And then finally, ensuring all have access to safe, affordable, energy efficient, accessible housing. I'll shift and talk about capturing carbon. This is really in terms of removing carbon from the air. And there were a set of practices, including changes to the use value appraisal program, carbon markets, and payment for ecosystem services. There were 4 items in the climate action plan that the administration offered a dissent on. The changes to the use value appraisal program was one. Obviously, there are an inordinate number of actions in the climate plan, and many of them have a ways to go to be built out in order to be able to be implemented. The 4 that we've identified as non-consensus items are ones where we don't fundamentally see a path to yes. And given the number of other options and opportunities where we believe there may be there's the ability to work through program design
and have a program that all can support. We wanted to be very clear and upfront in saying the 4 that we didn't see a path to yes on. The changes to the use value appraisal program in particular would be a dramatic expansion for forever wildlands that don't require management practices. And we have concerns both from the sustainability of the wood products industry in Vermont, as well as the impacts that this could have on taxpayers. And part of that reason is that our forest acreage in Vermont is declining slightly already. If you want to flip to the next slide. We know that over the last 15 years, or we estimate that we've lost about 60,000 acres of forest. It's a fairly modest amount when forest cover in Vermont is north of 4.5 million acres, but it's cumulative. And what the modeling we did in support of the Climate Action Plan shows is that we are on a trajectory with this kind of forest loss that could have us challenged to meet that net zero greenhouse gas emissions goal by 2050 if that rate of loss is maintained over time. Next slide, please. Which shows that we're facing similar trends in some of our agricultural lands as well, that fewer acres are being harvested each year. And if and as those acres aren't sitting fallow, but are rather being turned into residential areas, that again poses challenges to our ability to meet that net zero goal. Next slide, please. As I mentioned at the outset, this last group of solutions is really cross-cutting, things that check multiple of those other impact areas. And on the next slide, please, you'll see that there was an emphasis on compact settlement patterns. This includes the ability to make centralized infrastructure investments, and this work would be supported by regulatory changes to encourage that kind of growth. This is an area where, again, there were 2 of the non-consensus recommendations. One, in establishing a goal for the state of no net loss of natural or working lands, and one around developing a state-level land use policy or plan. Also acknowledged in this section is the need for capacity to support the implementation of this work. This will be obviously a significant undertaking that will touch each and every one of us. That it needs to, again, be guided by a statewide environmental justice policy, bringing that equity lens to the work throughout, looking at workforce issues and expanding training and other resources to support workforce development, the need for comprehensive climate education programs in our schools, and then encouraging personal actions, particularly in leveraging the purchasing power of the individual. So if we flip to the next slide, I have just 3 left, talking a little bit about what you'll find in the Climate Action Plan. And the Climate Action Plan is available on our website now, which is climatechange.vermont.gov. As I hope you have a taste for in that quick tour through the recommendations in the climate plan, the Vermont Climate Council developed a broad and far-reaching set of recommendations. They're organized into 26 pathways, 64 strategies, and then these 234 action items or operational tasks. And flipping to the next slide, just what happens next now that we have this initial plan? Well, there's jobs for everyone. The Climate Council has a couple of pieces of work yet to do. The change around TCI was unanticipated. That was one where we didn't have a plan B, and it leaves us with a hole in how we would achieve the greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirements. So there's work going on in that space around strategies for the transportation sector. The council anticipates making recommendations to both the governor and the General Assembly about the deployment of ARPA funds to support some of this work. I anticipate the council will also bring forward a request for additional budget to support further technical analyses and study that are identified in the Climate Action Plan as central to continuing our evaluation. And then we'll continue to prioritize building equity into climate action and helping ensure a just transition. ANR is continuing to do work on what we call the pathways analysis, which starts to bring some of the economics of climate change into these strategies and actions to help facilitate further conversations. And then the rulemaking items, the Global Warming Solutions Act stated that any rulemaking identified in the Climate Action Plan and are needed to move directly to implement. And so we will be initiating rulemaking related to the California Clean Car and Clean Truck standards in the next several weeks. It also has a directive to JFO to prepare an analysis of the economic, budgetary, and fiscal costs and benefits of the plan. JFO has been participating in many of the Climate Council meetings. And so we've built that awareness of what's sort of being undertaken by ANR as part of the pathways analysis to help inform what work remains. And then before flipping to the last slide, which just talks about the legislature's role in this, I just want to emphasize the importance that the council had placed on co-creation and broad-based public engagement in building out the policies and programs in the Climate Action Plan. The timeline was enormously challenging to this, to try to do this work in 12 months and have robust public engagement, particularly endeavoring to reach members of underserved and marginalized and rural communities who may not often participate in state-led processes, proved challenging. And I don't think any of us feel a high degree of comfort that we had success. I think the best we could say is we tried and we'll continue to try to extend that work around engagement and outreach. And then just in terms of the last slide, a lot of the activity identified in the plan at this point is ready to move back to the legislature. And I think these are some, what I envision as possible steps the General Assembly might choose to take, identifying a suite of high impact policy priorities that get at durable environmental outcomes. One of the challenges the Climate Council identified is that the greenhouse gas emissions reductions are requirements versus the work around adaptation and resilience. But we know that work is those tangible steps to improve landscape level resilience are what's necessary to lessen the effects of climate change on Vermonters. And so how to balance those. Thinking about appropriating the ARPA funds, one of the pieces of feedback we've received from some of our partners in this space is having a multi-year planning horizon for this work is important to their ability to scale up. And so in order to achieve the speed and scale of the implementation actions required by the Act, looking at giving folks at least several years of confidence that funding exists, understanding what those additional analyses are and contractor support that'll be needed to fulfill the requirements. This means a deeper look into our emissions inventory and a carbon budget for the state of Vermont, thinking about data collection and management that we will need to undertake to track progress, the climate toolkit for municipalities that I mentioned earlier, as well as that emphasis on public outreach and engagement. And then just a piece that the council specifically had asked me to bring to the body today is that as vacancies arise on the council, to look to add to the diversity of the council and the ability to support those appointees with just compensation. That is the end of the presentation. I don't know, Catherine, if you want me to take questions or just.
I'm just going to say one thing. I just want to remind members on Zoom that you can send your questions via chat. I don't know if does anybody here have any questions for the secretary? Use your mic. And please identify yourself so people on Zoom.
No, that one doesn't. Oh, it does work. The light doesn't work. Okay. Sarah Copeland-Hansis. Thank you, Secretary Moore, for being with us today. And thank you for 12 months of a really wild ride leading the Climate Council through this process. As you mentioned in your presentation, the real work begins now as we have to turn to the implementation phase. And in fact, the real work ramps up even more when we look at how we go from our 2025 goals to our 2030 goals, which are even more aggressive. And so I guess what I wanted to ask you is, how are we going to do that? I guess in particular, I want to prompt a conversation about whether we need to have an Office of Climate Action housed somewhere within state government who can help to coordinate so many of these activities that are going to happen across not only the Agency of Natural Resources, but in many other places around state government as well?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. It's certainly, there are recommendations in the climate action plan around the role a climate office could play. I think, if you look at other major policy initiatives across state government, there are different models. The Clean Water Initiative program, for example, is housed in the Agency of Natural Resources and has what I would call dotted line relationships to sister agencies that have important roles to play in that space: agriculture, transportation, commerce and community development, chief among them. And it works, and it yields the kinds of coordinated results and effort that we need. That said, there are certainly other places where there's been a centralization of some of those services. And I think a little bit of it depends on sort of the policy and programmatic pieces and how they're rolled out. Certain actions, I think, have real clear homes. Efforts to expand electric vehicle charging infrastructure within state-owned right-of-ways is clearly a thing that VTrans is already doing, and happens to be the landowner around. Whereas some of the other initiatives, weatherization at scale may be a great example. They're pieces of it, not only within state government, but within entities outside of state government when we're talking about services and opportunities for middle and upper income Vermonters. So I'm not sure that there's an answer. I think that there's probably a number of different solutions, but ensuring that coordination is planful and put in place now is really important. I would say even more so than a climate office. Just having that be front of mind as we're designing policies and programs.
So good. This one works. It's like a total game in the House chamber.
Can you identify yourself?
Sorry. I'm Representative Selena Colburn, and I'm just curious, there's just again, I want to echo Representative Copeland-Hanzas. Thanks for your work and the just hugely heavy lift of leading this group and producing this plan. There's, as you've just highlighted, a ton of recommendations coming from the council itself, some that the administration agrees with and some that you all don't, which I acknowledge puts you in a tricky spot in some ways. But it's clear from the Global Warming Solutions Act that we're kind of all of us accountable for really doing the heavy lifting of moving this work forward. And I'm wondering if you could give us a preview of any particular actions that the administration is really prepared to put your weight behind and partner with us on, and that we're likely to see as priorities for all of you.
Sure. I think, the top of the list is frankly the California and clean car and clean truck standards, because that's a place where ANR has existing rulemaking authority, and it's consistent with the requirement of the Global Warming Solutions Act. I think the other place to look will be some of those ARPA-related investments that can hopefully help scale up different types of initiatives that we know are going to be central to the successful implementation of the Act. Weatherization may be chief among them. The Climate Council met yesterday and had a presentation from Doug Farnham with the Agency of Administration to help understand what the opportunities and sideboards are when it comes to deploying ARPA funds in service of climate action. The council is going to be taking up that work over the next couple of weeks, and I anticipate we'll be making a set of recommendations to both the governor and to the General Assembly for consideration. And know that the governor intends to take very seriously the recommendations brought forward by the Climate Council. I think again, the challenge is going to be sort of how to most effectively utilize those dollars to sort of set us off on the right path and pace necessary to ultimately achieve the requirements of the Act.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here today. I just have a brief question on capturing carbon and the bullet that says change in use value appraisal program. So what I'm wondering is, will that entail curtailing or to changing timber harvesting rules within that program? in order to mitigate fragmentation, forest fragmentation, and leave more green space or greenery to absorb carbon. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
So the climate action plan actually contained a set of recommendations around changes to the use value appraisal program that it was recommended that the General Assembly consider. One of them was particularly problematic for the administration, and that was the expansion of this Forever Wild program from not just nonprofit organizations that can hold those kinds of easements, but to private landowners. We feel very strongly that part of the way we keep our forests is by having them remain economically viable, and are concerned that as we scale back timber harvesting activities, it has to be done with an eyes wide open in terms of the overall impact that we'll have on forest land cover. And frankly, speaking at least for myself, didn't feel like we got to that level of discussion within the Climate Council. I think it's a really challenging area to weigh the economic viability of our working lands, both farms and forests, and the opportunity they present to sequester carbon, but we need to keep them as natural and working lands in order for those opportunities to exist. And just didn't feel like, the administration didn't feel like we were in a position to wade into that space. It didn't seem like there was a successful path at this point in time.
Thank you. This is Lucy Rogers. My question was the bullet about invest in load management and grid optimization. So if you could just elaborate a little bit on what that would look like. And then I think the Climate Council, is it the opinion of the Climate Council that it is going to be possible with load management and grid optimization to be able to absorb the additional electrical use as the transportation sector transitions over?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So that's sort of got two pieces to it. One is trying to make sure we both are able to take full advantage of renewable generation capacity that's already online in the state of Vermont. There are parts of our grid that are particularly constrained, and at times we aren't actually able to utilize all of the renewable energy that's being generated currently. And load optimization and storage are sort of key to trying to be able to take full advantage of those renewables, as well as new ones that we anticipate would need to be brought online. Some of those smart technologies where this ties into the broadband initiative, whether it's power walls in people's homes or the ability for the utility to tap into the batteries in electric vehicles to help balance some of our loads, is going to be really important going forward. My understanding is, and this is an area of not my expertise, is we do have some headspace in our current sources of electricity in order to be able to grow. So this isn't an immediate problem, but it's certainly a before 2050 challenge that we need to be aware of, and looking to put in place those kinds of technologies and tools to take, as I say, take full advantage of renewables that are on the grid right now and ones that are yet to come. Did that answer your question?
I think it did. Thank you. And just that the graph that shows the growth of electricity demand primarily due to the transportation sector, that you're saying there's enough room for growth that the grid will be able to take on that.
I think in the
demand.
near term, my understanding it is not necessarily sufficient to be able to support that full load demand shown in 2050. But for the next several years, we do have headspace above where we're at right now.
I'm going to just read one. You could just read it. I'll let you read it. This is a comment from that came in through the chat.
Okay. This is from Representative Dolan, and she says, I note a number of the actions you mentioned that are necessary to help our communities become more resilient to the impacts of a changing climate, particularly the frequency and magnitude of severe weather. We look forward to working with the administration as we see that many of these actions have clean water benefits as well. And yes, I wholly agree. I think on the resilience side, there are many win-win opportunities to improve soil health and to improve forest resilience, as well as community resilience that have clear water quality benefits.
Thanks. This is Catherine Sims. Thank you so much for this body of work, really, to you and the whole council. It's a really powerful roadmap to guide our work in the coming session. My understanding is that the action plan will be updated sort of at minimum every 4 years, but also really appreciate that the cover page calls it the initial plan. And I think I've heard you mention before that this is really an iterative process and that the public hasn't had an opportunity to weigh in since this initial draft has been released. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what that ongoing public outreach might look like and what your expectation is in terms of ongoing revisions and iterations of the plan moving forward. Thanks.
Sure, that's a great question. So there's sort of several components to the answer. There are a couple of places where we sort of put pins in things that need further discussion and work that we weren't able to complete prior to December 1st. Probably most notably is in that transportation space and kind of the hole that was left by TCI. But also there was a significant conversation around the role of biomass in both our heat and our electricity profiles going forward. That needs more work and consideration. So those are places where I think the council we gave ourselves some deadlines of I think 6 to 9 to 12 months to really try to make progress in those spaces and update the plan. There is, in addition, a phase of our outreach and engagement work that anticipated we wouldn't have time for that second round of kind of public comment as we were completing work on the initial plan. We went out, as many of you may be aware, in September and sort of framed what we saw as the challenges and some of the high-level pathways for the public, but they haven't necessarily had the opportunity to weigh in on those operational tasks and actions. And so there's work contemplated in that space starting next month, making sure that anyone who's participated in the process to date or otherwise expressed interest is aware that the plan is up, encourage them to have a look, as well as the pieces that are either being taken up by the legislature or by the agency through the rulemaking process, making sure they understand what the sort of the public comment for component of those efforts are, as well as looking at how to continue to build out our engagement and outreach efforts, particularly again focused on marginalized and underserved communities, and trying to make sure we're hearing from those folks directly about what considerations are necessary to have successful programs, not just what we think the elements of a successful program might look like.
About one more, yes.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. This is Representative Becca White. I serve on the Transportation Committee, and you've noted a few times the unfortunate moment in time we're in with TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative. And I'm wondering if you could speak to whether the Climate Council or the administration has considered alternative regional compacts or other cap and invest solutions besides TCI.
Yeah, we haven't really. I mean, we sort of in many ways had committed to TCI as a process for the last several years and had been an active participant in the discussions with other states in the region. And we're continuing to sort of monitor and keep tabs on what had happened in the TCI space. And so it very much was a placeholder in the way we modeled out our transportation, anticipated transportation emissions reductions. So it leaves us with an unfortunate gap. But hadn't contemplated any other sort of replacement programs. We sort of assumed TCI was the one that was the most developed. And if we were to go that route, that would be the logical choice.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Secretary Moore. I appreciate that. And again, yes. Now we're going to move on to Josh Hanford, who's the Commissioner of the Department of Housing and Community Development, and he is going to give you an update on housing.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Josh Hanford, Commissioner of Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development. Thanks for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. I know you've already had a long day, so appreciate you wanting to hear more about housing. I think you all know it's no secret that we have a housing crisis in Vermont and throughout much of the country. I've built in some time for questions today, so feel free to interrupt me or wait to the end. And before I jump right into giving you stats and data and defining the problem and telling you about what I think the solutions are, I thought it would be helpful to tell you a little bit about my housing story and experiences, because having housing, a home, a place to live, is something that we, at least the General Assembly and state staff here, all have in common. And our experiences, how we came about our housing situation, are all different, and they're all important in this discussion. I live in a great home, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, on a nice road in Rochester. Sorry, Randolph. I moved to Randolph from Rochester. But, you know, I feel lucky, I feel grateful. But I remember a time when I was just a kid that wasn't the case. You know, the apartment I lived in was too small for us, it wasn't adequate, and my bed was in the kitchen. I remember living in a crowded single-wide mobile home that was always too cold in the winter. I remember when my family home that my parents were so proud they finally owned was foreclosed on. And I remember driving 2 hours each way to work because housing was unavailable or too expensive. It's with all these experiences that I know we must act. We must use this crisis to change course in Vermont. So next slide. So what is the current state of housing in Vermont? Let's start with some facts and data on the housing situation. This first slide shows 2 graphs. The one on the left shows you a dramatic decline in residential building permits, both single-family homes and multifamily homes since 1980. Back then, we were permitting between 3,000 and 5,000 homes per year. From 1980 to 1990, we dropped off dramatically, rose back up a little in the early 2000s, but we hit an all-time low in 2012 with just under 1,300 permits a year. You can see we're starting to creep back up around 200 permits per year. Why do these residential building permits matter? The next graph on the right shows the average annual increase in non-vacation housing supply by decade, and the most recent decade shows a meager 0.2% increase in housing supply. That is virtual stagnation in the net number of new homes available according to the Vermont State Housing Needs Assessment. This accounts for natural loss of conversion of homes, natural loss and conversions of homes over time. And without building enough new homes and apartments to increase the housing supply, we have scarcity. We have been underbuilding new homes needed in Vermont for over 3 decades. Next slide. This slide shows when our housing stock was built. You can see the majority of our housing was built a long time ago, and newly built housing is a very small part of our housing stock. Next slide. This next slide shows the supply of homes for sale in Vermont and nationally. We are at historic low supplies and continue to decrease. Homes are selling in record time, and the inventory is down over 30% from last year. The chart on the right shows the declining vacancy rates for apartments. And we know that vacancy rates well below 5% is a sign of an unhealthy market. Without enough homes to buy or apartments to rent, prices go up. Our lack of supply and inventory creates scarcity, and that drives up costs and makes housing unaffordable to many Vermonters, as you can see in the next slide. The bar graph on the left shows that 51% of Vermont renter households are considered cost burden, meaning they're spending more than 30% of their total household income on rent. And of those, 25% are severely cost burden, meaning paying more than 50% of their household income on rent. The stress of living with most of your money going to pay for just the roof over your head is unbearable and unsustainable in the long run. And it's a recipe for an increase in homelessness, period. Vermont values on whole have risen by 18%. Vermont home values on whole have risen by 18% over last year. But we know the value and sale of homes is very different across the state. In some communities, the rise has been almost 80%. The annual median home price in Vermont sold rose from $245,000 to 200 in 2020 to almost 259 in 2021. This is just based on the property transfer tax data. If you look, you can find numbers that are much, much higher than that. But those are based on MLS data and leave out a lot of the modest homes that are sold through for sale by owner. The median price for newly constructed homes in Vermont last year rose to $388,000 statewide and $446,000 in Chittenden County last year. Next slide. So what are the barriers to the housing? Why are we not building enough housing? Why can't we afford the housing we have? There are a lot of different barriers. If you ask 100 people, you're probably going to get 100 different responses. I'm going to tell you a little about what I hear and what people point to. Some point to the need for higher wages. If employers just paid their workers more so they can afford the housing that is available. There's some evidence to suggest that wages are increasing lately, but this is a much bigger economic issue. Some point to the lack of investment by the federal government in programs that build affordable housing. Recent recovery funding aside, this is true, the federal funding for housing development has been on a steady decline since the early 1990s. Can we make up for this lack of investment with new recovery resources and the Build Back Better bill? Some point to the lack of new and existing or adequate infrastructure. The water and sewer you need to build housing at any scale. The lack of water and sewer is a non-starter or is too expensive for most housing developers to absorb. And municipalities built most of their infrastructure footprint decades ago. Add to this brownfield cleanup when you're looking to reuse properties that have had a past purpose or actual buildings that have had a past purpose. The brownfields cleanup is very expensive when you want to reuse it for housing. So the new resources, all the new resources that we have to address our infrastructure needs, we just got a huge boost. You know, can we effectively use this to help address some of this need? Some people point to outdated, cumbersome, redundant, and restrictive land use regulations, bylaw, zoning, and permitting. Our past regulations around building housing have ended up doing a pretty good job of permitting and building large lot, expensive housing for families that look a lot like this. Next slide. In locations that are not close to work, are not walkable, and not near vibrant centers. This has resulted in a mismatch of our existing housing stock, the majority of which was built before 1970, and what we need now, due to the changing demographics, is housing built for families that look more like this next slide. I think it's surprising for most folks to hear that in the Northeast, our median housing lot size is at 17,772 square feet. And it's more than double the size of the national average of 8,890, and way more than the spacious West of just 7,044 square feet. This is the exact opposite of what we should expect, given the fact that the Northeast is the most densely populated region of the country overall, more built out than any other parts of the country, with less developable land. One would expect communities to make the most out of our scarce space. Instead, new homes in the Northeast have larger lots. Next slide. This large lot development is what we permitted and adds cost. But as this slide demonstrates, we have tons of potential infill opportunities that fit nicely in our existing neighborhoods, supports our environmental goals, and helps us meet the new housing we need of our changing demographics. That's if we reform our land use permitting and zoning. Some point to out of control costs of building. Next slide. Sometimes referred to as the 3 L's, labor, lumber, and land. In recent survey of Vermont residential builders, developers, more than 89% of the survey respondents indicated that costs have increased beyond their expectations. Even more startling is that more than 64% reported that they have abandoned or substantially delayed starting a project due to cost pressures. Next slide. This slide shows how dramatically our per unit cost on multifamily housing construction have risen in the last 5 years. But it's more than just a cost of land, lumber, labor. In this survey of the same residential developers and home builders in Vermont, many lamented that the requirements at the state and local level are extremely complex, create additional risk, and suppress many projects from ever getting off the ground, or reduce the number of homes built and projects that end up moving forward. The National Association of Home Builders' latest data shows that on average, regulations imposed by governments at all levels account for 24% of the final price of a new single-family home built for sale. Next slide. And if you add in the cost of access to capital, construction loans are higher risk and they're more expensive. Throw in some good old NIMBYism, not my backyard, and it's expensive to build the housing we need. Next slide. So how about a little bit of good news now? We have some recent success, some new resources, some solutions, some progress to show you. By my accounting of dozens of programs and funding sources from the recovery, we have over $820 million of new funding that's been made available to assist low-income households struggling with housing-related needs in Vermont during this pandemic. Over 42,000 Vermont households have benefited from some type of assistance, including rental, utility, and mortgage payment assistance, emergency housing, services, supports, and direct aid. Over 14,000 households have received more than $63 million in emergency rental assistance to date, also supporting over 4,000 property owners and landlords pay their bills. The rental and utility assistance is ongoing, and it's available for at least another year, and can assist eligible households for up to 18 months in total assistance. More than 1,100 households have received assistance paying their mortgage and property taxes to date. And an additional $50 million for this purpose will soon be available and will continue for the next few years. Next slide. Collectively, we've helped 1,305 households exit homelessness into permanent housing, many with ongoing subsidies and services. And with these new resources, 779 new affordable housing units have already been built or occupied, and half of these units were made available to rehouse those experiencing homelessness. Nearly 800 additional housing units, again with half available to house the homeless, are under development as we speak, with even more funded over the winter. And despite this dramatic cost increases and supply shortages and labor shortages and COVID stops, we've been able to more than double the affordable housing production compared to the average year when you look back at data over the last 5 years. That last 5 years even included the housing revenue bond, which was the largest then increase in housing investment. Next slide. Here are just a few pictures from VHCB of new housing built. I'm sure they'd be happy to share a lot more of the great projects with you. We've got Susan's Place in Essex Junction, which is 68 permanent apartments for people experiencing homelessness, and it used over 13 million in COVID relief funds. The project on the right is having its opening today, probably about now, in St. Johnsbury, and it's a dramatic rehab of an existing property, reconfigured to house 40 quality apartments, increase in safety code and energy, and preserved rental assistance with a total development cost of over $14 million. Next slide. Here's a few examples from VHCB representing the nearly 800 units that are currently under development. Again, there are tons of examples. These two, the one on the left is Butternut Station in Winooski. It's a Champlain Housing Trust project. It's creating 20 new condominiums on Mallets Bay Ave on land that was donated by the city. It's going to address some of the very tight housing markets there. It also plans to target sales to BIPOC members of the community, which have a much lower homeownership rate in Vermont. And it's near a community health center and the city library. Total development cost is $7.6 million. The one on the right is a Bellows Falls garage. It's in Bellows Falls, Vermont, and it's going to, after the site cleanup, this is a brownfield. It'll be 27 new apartments on the side of a vacant auto repair facility and a parking garage. This new construction is within walking distance of the train station, bus stops, services, and shops, has a total development cost of just under $10 million. Next slide. Here's more housing made available through the Vermont Housing Improvement Program. These properties shown here are from Caledonia and Windham County. They're part of 240 apartments in existing properties all across the state that were completely rehabilitated and made available to folks in need, with about half serving the homeless, with $7.5 million in Corona relief funds. Another $5 million of ARPA funds was just released for this purpose, and it's aimed to support about 140 new units through the VHIP program, again, dedicating most of those to serving the homelessness, those exiting homelessness. Next slide. So a lot more needs to be done to address Vermont's housing crisis. We need a robust proposal with at least another 180 million dedicated to housing construction this year. We need to increase our housing development capacity. We need to continue reinvesting in our existing but poor quality housing stock through programs like VHIP that takes older underutilized properties and cost effectively makes them quickly available to those exiting homelessness and others in need of affordable housing. We need to continue funding more rental housing like the projects from VHCB, affordable to low and moderate income households, and supportive housing to rehouse the homeless. And we need to continue support for mental health and housing service delivery. We need to find a way to incentivize missing middle homeownership production and development. Building modest new homes with new tools to help first-time and first-generation homebuyers in Vermont. Much is working well, but we need the funding and the flexibility to pilot new approaches, to fill identified gaps, like a statewide risk mitigation pool for affordable homeownership development projects and to support landlords. To make our investments more efficient and go farther, and to have a lasting impact once this historic level of funding is gone, we need to make foundational changes to our zoning, permitting, and regulatory framework through programs like Zoning for Great Neighborhoods and smart reforms to Act 250. I want to end with an excerpt from a special message to Congress. Next slide. That was made on housing in January 25th, 1954 by Dwight Eisenhower. The development of conditions under which every American family can obtain good housing is a major objective of national policy. It's important for two reasons. First, good housing and good neighborhoods is necessary for good citizenship and good health among our people. Second, a high level of housing construction and vigorous community development are essential to the economic and social well-being of our country. It is therefore properly a concern of this government to ensure the opportunities are provided every American family to acquire a good home. Now, I know the federal government's response to housing in the 1950s wasn't fair, and it wasn't equal, and it left out many. But that's why we should seize this moment to make the just, equitable, and foundational changes to our housing policies to make Vermont pro-housing growth for all incomes and ages and families. The Vermont we all want and need, at least I think, that welcomes new families and diverse neighbors can happen if we make changes now and invest in our future. So thanks for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Let me just remind the members who are zooming in that you can send in questions on the chat function. And are there any questions in the chamber? I think I see one. Is it one coming through? All right. Oh, yes, Tom, sorry.
Thank you, Commissioner. Update.
My fault.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your kind words about this issue. This has been something that you and I have spent, you spent a lot of time in our room working on these issues, and I appreciate you sharing this update with us. My concerns are going to be related to not just what we can do and not just what tools we can provide to both public and private developers, but that next part, zoning is part of it, but how are we going to break through the wall of self-interest? Real estate tends to be very self-interested. We can think about projects that are necessary from our perspective, but how can we do better reaching out to municipalities with local zoning, landowners who own so much acreage that can be developed and yet they're not coming forward to share, or they're not coming forward to sell, and it's personal property. And third part, how can we combat affordability with what is the market, which is the price of private ownership? And I'm just curious to know whether you've been contemplating that along with the other aspects of this crisis that you just talked about.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Stevens. I think a couple things going on there. We have a scarcity issue across many income levels. And we have some tools and we have some historic funding to address affordable subsidized housing, which we're doing a good job. We could do more. We could always do more. I think where the real challenge is in this sector of housing that is market rate, but it serves middle-class families, and it's not being built at the rate we need for a number of reasons. That the projects are upside down. They need a subsidy to break even. Otherwise, they build to a higher end, which working class families in Vermont can't afford. And to date, there hasn't really been a federal program or something since back in the 50s, ironically, that helped subsidize that sort of modest home building. There is a federal home ownership building tax credit contemplated in the Build Back Better bill that could start this. It's a new initiative to allow tax credit equity to go into building modest home ownership. There are efforts here in Vermont to talk about piloting that first, to do something with state resources to get that off the ground. That would help bring about those self-interests of, you've got to make a little bit of money on this development, otherwise you can't lose money. So they cost $400,000 to build a home. We need them to sell it $250,000 to $300,000. If it costs $400,000, they build $500,000 homes. That's just how it works. And so we need something that's modest, that is in the public interest to break down that gap, is one of the things I think we should work on. I think there's available land out there. There's all sorts of infill opportunities. We have huge lots that have very few people living in those large homes that are right for infill development, meet our environmental goals, make our communities more vibrant and walkable. There's tons of potential there. We have a lot of zoning reform to do in our communities, and communities are responding. We have a program called Zoning for Great Neighborhoods. With your help, we passed a bylaw modernization bill last year where we're making funds available to towns to update their bylaws and be pro-housing. We have an overwhelming response to that funding. We've already oversubscribed. So I think there's progress to be made, but we've got to put our heads down and keep at it. Thanks.
All right. We have a question from the chat.
Thank you much for this incredible presentation and for your clear directive. Given that the biggest area on hold, our wealth in this country is in our homes, equity will not move truly out of cycles of generational poverty without making homeownership available to low and moderate income individuals. What are the specific policies that you would propose to significantly expand homeownership in this area? Exactly. That's exactly what I was talking about before with this federal resource on the horizon. If the Build Back Better bill passes and this stays intact, we have to find a way to provide modest subsidies so that folks can purchase modest homes and have that wealth transfer. And if we target first-time home buyers, first generation, folks that never owned a home, we can transfer that wealth. But it has to be on equal terms for those folks. If they're going to have to return their entire subsidy to get into that program, they might not be able to transfer wealth. And that's the trick. If we recapture all those funds and recycle it, their wealth might not transfer. And so we have some models that help, but we don't have one that's as clear, that's simple, that doesn't scare people away, that gives folks a fair chance to be homeowners, to build that wealth that they can pass on generation to generation. And we've done a poor job in this country bringing new people into homeownership that don't come from a background of wealth or privilege. And we owe it to the next generation to be more fair and equitable in this area. And I think it is good public policy, and it's worth the public benefit to put some resources into those families, even if they're above an income that we typically target for affordable housing, because they will be stuck in rental and they will be out competing folks that even are of a lower income than them, because they can't move to a home ownership opportunity and be fully vested in the community. You know, the employers are asking for this because they know if their employees buy homes in their community, they're going to stay at their company. And they are asking for something like this as well. And I think they want to be part of the solution with some sort of supports and subsidies for their workers to be homeowners.
Yes, thank you very much. I am a representative from Barry City. We have reformed our zoning. We have got rid of R10, what used to be called R10. It's only duplex or more. However, you're talking about private incentives and the necessary dependence on private capital. We, however, in the property tax system have a purely binary approach. That is to say, it's this flavor or it's that flavor. Many states have moved towards a more nuanced tax classification system, whether it's initiated with guardrails at the state level or left to the locals. I give you one. In Massachusetts, in fact, towns are allowed to differentiate between properties that are occupied year-round and those which are not. And interestingly enough, the subsidy is purely internal to the town, so that whatever someone else pays, the other folks don't pay. It's not a state system. I just ask you, are you open, if the legislature were open, to some kind of more sophisticated tax classification system? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. That's a great question. I think it'll be interesting to note that there's actually a pilot of this sort in the Climate Action Plan that talks about how can we tax the value of the land instead of penalizing folks that improve the property on the land. You know, there's a disincentive right now in communities like Barry or parts of Rutland where there is a number of structures that could be rehabilitated. But as those properties are upgraded, become more valuable, they're taxed more, and there's some folks that own these as investments and choose to not upgrade those properties, and we're sort of reverse incenting what we want. And so we have to maybe deploy new models around this. I call it, if I was to have my dream, we should have current use in our existing built environments that have a slow growth or disinvestment going on. We should be actually helping folks reinvest in those areas by not disincentivizing them by increasing their property taxes as soon as they invest in those properties. It's complicated, and I can't speak for everyone on this issue, but certainly interested in tax incentives to do what we want people to do with their properties and provide housing.
If I may, a quick comeback. It happens that we've already extended our stabilization authority to residential properties. So we've gotten rid of the problem you just described. However, that's really pretty de minimis. Thanks.
We might another one from the chat.
Yes.
How many people or families are looking for homes right now in Vermont and can't find one that is affordable? Well, I don't know the exact number, but it's a lot from the emails I get and others. You know, I have heads of agencies sending me their new employee that can't find a home. You know, can you personally help them try to find a home? There are not enough places for people to buy and rent across the state, period. We have a very short supply. That's all I can.
I saw Senator.
Madam Moderator, first question that was asked today by members of the legislature was about deficit spending at the federal level. 2 years ago, we met here in this chamber to discuss the same things we're discussing today. And 2 years ago, the federal government was contemplating a whopping tax cut for people who were already able to buy their homes and who today are able to buy second homes. And some of those buy third homes. Some of those invest their money with contractors that are eager to build larger homes for wealthy people rather than the less profitable homes that working people buy. We don't have a housing crisis. They're selling like hotcakes. But they're not selling to Vermont working people whose incomes haven't changed. I commend the speaker on his research about the history of housing back to President Eisenhower, when the tax rates were 90% for the very wealthy. And that money was used to help working people get mortgages, which working people paid for at their jobs. Today, 40, 50 years later, as we have continued to redistribute wealth in this country, we're sitting here blaming working people's inability to buy homes on zoning and actually putting in sewer systems. Meanwhile, the homes that are available for sale are being purchased, driving up the cost of homes in Vermont by 17% in the last year. What do we have before us to reverse the trend other than borrowing money and bonding for 30 years, which comes out of our general fund for the next 30 years, when we will say no new taxes, no new taxes, and have to tighten our belts because we've spent 30 years of money to subsidize people whose incomes are stagnant. What are we doing about incomes here? So it's a rhetorical question. I thank you, Madam Moderator, for our question. But we spend a lot of time nibble around the edges and we're not looking at our challenges.
You have a question? Yes.
Thank you. I'm John Bartholomew from Heartland. You had mentioned the cost of construction being really high. And there has obviously been an impressive increase in the cost of building materials that are often attributed to pandemic supply chains. I'm just wondering, are there any forecasts if this pandemic ever goes away that these impressive construction material costs will go down, or can we enjoy them staying up?
Yeah, that's a great one. I think it's fair to say that among all the housing colleagues I talk to, once the cost of construction reaches where it is, it's never gone down. You see that chart I showed earlier, 5 years of increase. That was before there were shortages. The reality is costs have been going up for a while, and this pandemic has just spiked it, and maybe they'll level off. We all plan for them to level off, but I don't know that they're going to drop back where they were 5 years ago anytime soon. So we're in for the long haul on these increased costs.
How about one more?
Thank you, Commissioner. Representative Molly Burke of Brattleboro. And this really interesting conversation. 40 years ago, my husband and I, newly married, had no money. We were able to get a farmer's home loan to buy our house with no down payment. We had no money for down payment. And initially, our mortgage payment was adjusted to our income. And I just feel so grateful for that opportunity. We're still in that house, raised family there. And to Senator McDonald's point, and to also the quote by Eisenhower, it's exactly what it is. It helps people to become engaged citizens. And I don't know what's happened to the Farmers Home Program, if it still exists or not, but it was just an amazing opportunity. I know other people who were able to benefit from that program, and it's such a great investment that I think really reaps economic rewards. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you. And, you know, there are a variety of down payment assistance programs, subsidized loan products out there in Vermont. They're used quite well, but frankly, the problem right now is there's supply. There's nothing to buy. We have programs that folks have been qualified for the down payment assistance for the subsidized mortgage, and they've been looking for a home for a year because the homes that are being sold are $500,000, $600,000, $800,000. They're very large homes, and there isn't developers out there building the modest 2-bedroom ranch, 2-bedroom cape that we saw built 3-4 decades ago. That's what the data shows us.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Commissioner. Well, thank you all. I'd like to thank the presenters. I'd like to thank all of the members for your engagement and your patience as we navigated the hybrid, the people who are both here in person and the people on Zoom. I want to thank the public for coming and engaging however they're engaging. There's staff in the background. You saw people in person, but there have been a lot of staff in the background making this work, the IT team, the Joint Fiscal Office, the House Clerk, others. And I want to just point out Teresa, who has juggled many logistics for this, but I don't know until you're sitting in the co-pilot seat, you have no idea what is going on and to make this hybrid work. So I'm thankful, and you should be thankful that she stayed there. To echo these presentations, we are living in unprecedented times. The Joint Fiscal Office team is we're looking forward to working with you in the upcoming session. All the documents are posted. If you have a question, email askjfo@leg.state.vt.us. Again, we appreciate your time and interest. Thank you. And for those of you traveling, safe